And if you were to look at altering the split, would you then go through assessments of viability and work through the detail of the practicality of how that might be achieved within a development?
That's the normal process. That's the normal process that's undertaken as part of any scheme and application of that. So yes, it comes into play.
I'm still slightly slightly confused by the question in a sense, because it strikes me that a certain amount of flexibility is already built into the process. And as you say, there's a time of 70-30 at the moment, but that as it stands at the moment is open to viability tests and things like that. So there's a certain amount of flexibility already. And here we're saying, okay, we're going to shift to 60-40, but should there be flexibility within that? Well, I thought that was probably fairly obvious, yeah. On a case-by-case basis, there should be flexibility, and every case-by-case basis should be looked at differently. But I mean, that's the way it pretty well works at the moment, so it would seem strange to move to a more restrictive.
I think it's probably whether or not we come out and overtly state in the city management plan that within the economic development area we take a far more flexible approach, and that it's not just looking at those normal individual site constraints, but we would also take into account the tenure mix within that area and look at criteria for doing that. And so, for example, if you found at a sub-ward level that it had high levels of social rented, that there would be a presumption in favour of these other tenures, particularly intermediate tenures, which you wouldn't find in other parts of Westminster. So I think that's what the question's getting at.
Well, so when you say sub-ward level, how would you judge the areas where you look at concentrations? If you can see, and that's not very clear from the back, you can see the red map there. Yeah. That's a map where we map census data to show the number of socially rented households in each super output area. And obviously the super output areas vary in size, but so you can't see the boundaries from where you're sitting. But the very darkest reds, they're areas where over 50% of the households live in social rented housing, either council or RSL, and then it goes, the middle red is between 30 and 50, and then the pink is much lower still, 20 to 30, and then the white is 0 to 10%. So we can identify those areas if we wanted to apply a policy whereby, if there's a certain amount of over a certain percentage of socially rented households in those areas, maybe we wouldn't want to increase that balance, so that we carry on with more intermediate housing in those areas. This is a suggestion, it's not.
I think as well the criteria is open for discussion here, so if anyone's got an idea, if anyone wanted to pursue this option whereby there was sort of a specifically stated extra flexibility in the economic development area, what criteria would you suggest that we use, for example? So we'd welcome those suggestions as well.
There's a very simple answer to that, isn't it? The market, which is exactly what you were saying in effect, was that, and also housing, that it depends upon where it is and it depends upon the viability, if you want to use that word. Because if it's not viable, the developer won't carry it out, you get nothing. So it's much better to be flexible, but within, shall we say, certain parameters, and that's where you're struggling at the moment, is what are the parameters? And they shouldn't be absolutely fixed, hard and fast, because otherwise it won't happen. And what we're after is things happening. Now, it may well be that in a particular site you'd be better off with an 80-20 or even a 90-10, and in another site with perhaps a greater percentage than that. So flexibility must be the best way, and let the market decide what is right. And at the end of the day, the planning committee will make that decision based upon what the developer comes to you and says, this is what is viable to us. You can then say, well, it's not viable to us because we want more of this or more of that, but it must be flexible.
So you're suggesting an option whereby it's based on site-by-site negotiations, and that we just offer flexibility.
I would be much happy with that, taking Councillor Graham's point that it may well be that in Church Street we're at exactly the right balance at the moment. If that's what she's saying as the Ward Councillor, we're at the right balance. We should be very careful about not setting that balance, which is very fine. Because if we try and socially engineer wards, that is the worst thing that could happen. So therefore, we have to take all the things into account on a case-by-case basis.
Is it the case that any development in any other part of the city applies that same sort of proportion? So if there is a private development going on in Mayfair, does that then have 40% social housing? Do we apply that?
Yes, it's the same percentage everywhere. Well, apart from the
70-30 then?
Well,
Currently 70-30.
well, at the moment on the largest sites we apply 70-30. Yeah. So that's 70 social, 30 intermediate.
But that's presumably out of the 50%
That's right,
affordable housing, so it's 50%
That's right,
private,
yeah.
50% affordable,
Yeah.
and then of the 50% affordable, it's a 70-30 split.
Yeah.
I see.
Or it could be much less than 50%. It could be, 20-30%.
So what this question is saying is, in this area, on the proportion of affordable housing that we are requiring, should we be more flexible on the balance between the social and intermediate affordable housing element of those schemes, presumably with a view to thinking there's a lot of social housing up in the area, perhaps we ought to be encouraging more intermediate and less social.
Yeah, I think. Now that I finally understood the question,
Sorry about that.
likewise. Yeah, I think it sounds really sensible to have a 60-40 rather than 70-30, because I think that certainly my experience of an area like Church Street, like I said, we want to be careful about social engineering, but in the end, Church Street has a range of problems that result from its 80% social housing. I'm not criticising everyone who lives in social housing, but the truth is that when social housing was first conceived, it was quite positive economically. It was the first rung on a ladder for a lot of young couples, if you like, and they used social housing and then they moved on. What now happens is that you have to have such a high level of need to get a unit of social housing, so we end up concentrating a lot of need in an area, and it becomes very difficult for the public infrastructure to deal with that. So I think that at the margins, shifting that balance a little and introducing more positive economic potential mix, I think would be useful, certainly for what you're trying to deal with those sort of problems you get.
Definitely recorded that.